Do you see the white in my beard? Yeah, I feel like over the last few months, I have earned every white hair that you see. Since the beginning of the year, we decided to sell our home and have basically remodeled every room inside of it. Ashley's made a career shift from 14 years as a physical therapist to a marketing job for the same company she was already with. Personally, I've knocked out about 165 hours of real estate classes and jumped headfirst both into ministry and life as a realtor, all while raising miles and trying to figure out where in the world we want to live after our house gets sold. Our house hasn't been completely cleaned since February, and we've kept at least one significant project going on each floor of the house for months now. Life has been loud and it's been busy, to say the least. I tell you this because it's important to know what kind of chaos nearly led to my son's early demise. A few weeks back, I was in the other room working on another project, and I heard what no parent ever wants to hear. Loudly, from the bathroom downstairs, came a word that made my face turn immediately red. I heard my precious, sweet, innocent little boy Miles shout loudly and proudly, "Oh, shoot." Except he didn't say shoot. I mean, you always believe in the back of your mind that you'll handle things differently than your parents did. But in the end, that's never true, is it? I stood at the top of the stairs with all the intimidation, anger, and disdain I could muster, and I said what my father said, and his father before him said, "Excuse me, young man, what did you just say?" To which he replied with absolutely no guilt and no hesitation, "Oh, shoot." But again, it wasn't shoot. I had just finished picking out his burial plot in the back of my mind when this strange feeling came over me. I think they call it wisdom. It's a foreign traveler in my brain, but it showed up that day, and I yielded to that odd sensation and asked one more time, "Young man, come here and look at me in the eyes. Tell me what you just said." At this point, Miles skipped around the corner, totally clueless of his impending suffering, and then held this out. Yeah, an airplane. "Dad," he said, "I said, oh ship. What's the problem?" Now, all of this because life was too noisy to hear things clearly. All of this trouble because there was so much going on that I didn't have time to listen fully to what my child was saying. I mean, parents, how many out there have been there? I thought so. See, we're taught that the busier life is, and the more we're able to do at once, and the louder we turn up the volume, the more efficient and successful we'll be. But it's not true. The truth is, the louder life gets, the more prone we are to miss something big or important. For example, most of us at some point in time or another have been in the car, on a work call, while driving somewhere else from work, and missed the turn altogether. We turned the volume up on the call and missed the directions on the GPS. Yes, we were doing more at once, but we failed at one task due to the volume of the other. If you're like me, the older that I get, the more frustrated I find myself becoming in conversations where the ambient noise gets louder and louder. Yes, I will be that old man who pretends he knows exactly what you're saying, but doesn't have a clue. I may be him by next month. I struggle to narrow my focus and attention on what one person is saying because of the drum of the noise in everyone else's conversation. And here's the thing, noise isn't just audible, is it? I mean, how many spouses out there have become aware that while your husband or maybe your wife have been saying, sure, their eyes seem to be oddly locked, not on you, but on a television screen. And later, when you bring up that conversation that was so great and that you thought you were having with your spouse, the fact is you realize you were just having a monologue with yourself. So we don't always know how to describe it, and most of us have experienced some anxious sense deep within us that something about the pace and the volume of our lives is robbing us of something bigger, something better, something more important. And lost in the roar of the noise all around us, I suspect we're missing out on our spouse's voice, our neighbor's voices, our children's voices, and I am certain that lost in the noise, we are missing out on the voice of God. But the hum and the motion of life increases so subtly at times that it goes unnoticed. We don't realize how much we're losing until all of a sudden we become aware that the voices we once longed to hear more than any other have left us altogether. And as we dive a little deeper into this series on new rhythms in life, I want to ask you something that might sound crazy. What if? What if the life and the peace and the joy that God designed you to experience in your home and with your family and in communion with Him was actually possible, but not in the noise we've grown used to? What if we could find it again in that place we fear so much? In silence. So let me ask you this. Could there be an answer to the droning echo that has drowned out God's voice in our lives? And the answer, obviously, is yes. And today what we're going to begin to talk about is a practice and a rhythm that could change your life forever, but it's a rhythm that will require you to make changes to your life as well. It's a rhythm called silence and solitude. I know, it sounds about as much fun as a colonoscopy. Yeah, it sounds that bad. But hang with me, because what you may need to recognize is that you're missing out on more than you'll ever know until this practice becomes a part of your life. This practice has shaped the lives of followers of Jesus for literally thousands of years. And I believe it can shape your life and my life as well. And today, I want to start by reading about a man who lived some 900 years before the time of Jesus, which puts his life nearly 3,000 years before ours. His name was Elijah. And if there was ever a busy man in Scripture, Elijah was that man. See, Elijah was a prophet in Israel, and that meant he spoke to God's people on behalf of God. He helped them keep on track and follow God's desires. Elijah was a prophet, though, in a time when it wasn't so great to be one. The vast majority of Israel had turned away from God and stopped following Him, and they'd begun to run after some pretty abusive and crazy religious practices. And the king and the queen of that day, they had led the charge, which meant to be a prophet of God immediately marked you as an enemy of the state. The king had actually killed hundreds of God's prophets already, and Elijah was number one on his hit list. We begin reading just after Elijah wins an unthinkable victory. To prove a point to the king, Elijah prayed, and God stopped it from raining in his country for 3 years. Now, this was an agricultural society. That meant that famine and drought fell over the entire country. And when famine and drought came, that meant lower incoming taxes. Lower taxes meant a poorer king. And Elijah's prayer had literally devastated the king and his wife. His name was Ahab, and his wife's name, Jezebel. Elijah finally, after 3 years, rides back into town, stares the king down, and challenges all of his religious leaders to a battle of the gods. Now, the showdown, it played out like a movie. At the end, the entire nation rises up against the false prophets of the king and puts 400 of them to death on the same day. Elijah prays, and God not only then sends fire down from heaven, but later sends rain, proving that God was in control, not just of the country, but of the weather and everything else. Elijah's victory placed the country in absolute upheaval. It put a bigger bounty on Elijah's head, and what he discovers is that the queen herself, Jezebel, has vowed to end his life by the end of the next day. So what does this man of God do? How does a spiritual giant respond to this kind of pressure? Let's read and find out. It says this in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through 3. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done and how he had killed the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them." And here's the big part. Elijah was afraid, and he ran for his life. I mean, doesn't this sound so out of place? The prophet who prayed and stopped rain for 3 years, who led the charge to execute 400 of the king's henchmen, gets threatened by the queen that he's already defeated and then flees in fear just minutes after his victory. How in the world is this possible? Now pay close attention here, because this is what happened. We are most susceptible to fear and failure when life is at its busiest and its loudest. Let me say that again. We are most susceptible to fear and to failure when life is at its busiest and loudest. See, it doesn't matter if that noise is the hustle and the sound of victory or the shout of defeat. The louder our lives become, the more at risk we will find ourselves. See, God's voice had been drowned out in Elijah's life by the swirl of the events around him. Between the rain, the showdown, the execution, the victory, and the death threats, life had grown so loud and so busy that there was no space to hear the voice of the God who had led Elijah this far. Does that sound familiar? It does to me. Now pay attention though, because what happens next reveals so much about the subtle character of God. We pick up again in verse 3. Here's what it says. Elijah was afraid and he ran for his life. And when he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. And he came to a broom brush and he sat down and prayed that he might die. I've had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. See, Elijah discovered in that moment what NFL coach Vince Lombardi famously stated, that fatigue makes cowards of us all. But where was God in the middle of all this? Did he bail on Elijah out of embarrassment or anger? His right-hand man had run away. Was that what had happened? No, not at all. Here's what goes down. All at once, an angel touched him, meaning Elijah, and said, "Get up and eat." And he looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and he drank, and then he lay down again. Then the angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up, ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and he spent the night. So here's what we learn about the character of God in our moments of fatigue and failure, that God is present in our lives even when life is too loud to hear him or see him. See, God shows up in Elijah's life and disproves the myth that so many of us, especially men, definitely me, live believing, that we're the provider, that we're the protector, or we're the source of peace in our lives. But hear me, don't miss this. You are not the provider of your life. You are not the protector of your life. You are not the one who gives peace in your life, not for your family either. See, there is only one true provider, one true protector, and one true source of peace for any of us, and that person is God and God alone. The problem is that the louder we allow our lives to become, the less we are able to recognize it. See, Elijah's journey, it takes him a long way. He journeys deeper and deeper into the wilderness until he arrives at a sacred place called Mount Horeb, otherwise known as Mount Zion. It was there that Moses met with God and gave him the 10 Commandments. And when the noise settles down and it's just Elijah and God on the mountain again, God finally speaks up. His words are words that have haunted me at different times in my life. And I wonder today if God might be whispering the same words to you. Here's what God says to Elijah. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" I can't tell you how many times I found myself in chaos, trouble, or sin. And I do what we naturally do. I fight, I push, I try again and again and again, only to collapse in fatigue. And then finally, I get to still my heart, my mind, and my efforts before God, only to hear his voice. "Austin, what are you doing here? How did you get this far? This is not where you're supposed to be." Maybe right now you're in the middle of something big, something loud, something scary. And right now is the first time your soul has been still enough to hear God's voice. And what you're hearing is what I've heard and what Elijah has heard. It's what so many of us have heard time and time again. What are you doing here? And before you write God off fearing that he's about to reject you, hang on with me and see what happens next. Elijah looks back at God and he gives him an answer. He lists off all the things that had taken place as if God had not seen it, as if it had all gone unnoticed by God. He pours out his fears, his anxiety, his fatigue, and God simply asks him to step outside of the cave and wait. Wait, because he was about to come physically near to Elijah. I mean, doesn't that sound like the worst advice imaginable in the middle of a crisis? Wait? Wait? Imagine being Elijah. I didn't come here to wait. God, I came here for help. Maybe you can relate to this. But you know what I found? It's in the waiting and silence when the noise around us can finally slow down to nothing so that our souls and our minds can become available to the help God has always stood ready to provide. As we wait, God's able to redirect us to where we were supposed to be all along. Wait and watch as the walls don't cave in the silence. Wait and recognize that God's ability is so far beyond your own. Wait and understand your place in this world, that you are the one who is created and he is the creator. Nothing in your life is beyond his reach. So wait. For Elijah, it took a panic attack and a 40-day journey into nothingness to grasp this truth again. And here's what happens. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, there was an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face, and he went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. See, often we imagine if God were to show up in my life or your life, it would happen like one of these first big events. Lots of flare, lots of fanfare, great bunches of noise, a gust of wind, an earthquake, or a fire. But that's the point of this part of the story, isn't it? That God doesn't show up like the chaos in our lives. These things are the things that cause fear or worry or dread or panic. They're the embodiment of our busyness, the noise in our lives and our own anxieties. In the midst of our confusion and our worry, our panic, and our chaos, God says to you, as he said to Elijah, and as he's whispered into my ear again and again, I, the Lord, do not fear. I have no worries. I have no anxiety. I know precisely what to do. Maybe you need to be reminded of that truth today. God's not afraid. He's not scared. And whatever you're facing, God knows the best next step. But you'll have to wait in the silence to hear it. See, those without control, they scream and they shout in hopes of attaining it. But watch a master teacher, an elementary school teacher, when they need control of an uncontrollable classroom. They don't raise their voice, they don't shout, they don't make a fuss. They whisper. See, he who is in control has no reason to shout. And so it is with God. And it's for this reason that you and I desperately need intentional, periodic moments of silence. They are vital to our lives. See, it's in silence that we regain the voice of God. It's in silence that we hear his whisper. It's in silence that we remember that he is ultimately in control after all. So what does God do? He sends Elijah not somewhere else, right back to where he came from. And on his way, God raises up 2 new kings who defeat Ahab and his wife Jezebel. He gives Elijah not only a helper, but his future successor, and identifies that in spite of Elijah thinking he was the only one left, there were 7,000 people who would have Elijah's back. Now don't miss this. God had this plan all along. This wasn't something new that he brought about because Elijah panicked and ran to a sacred mountain. Elijah panicked because he hadn't remained still enough to remember that God was in charge, that God knew what to do, that God was in control. See, this is the power of silence. When we look at the ministry of Jesus, we see that silence was a built-in rhythm of his life. Jesus begins his ministry only after going into what was a 40-day journey of silence. Some translations call where he went the wilderness, but that same word can be translated differently to mean the quiet place. That word is used frequently throughout the New Testament to describe this act in Jesus' life. It was only after 40 days in the quiet place that Jesus was able to do battle with the devil and emerge unscathed. Again, after feeding 5,000 people, he and his disciples were exhausted. And Jesus, rather than sending them out on the next mission, calls them away to hang out alone in the quiet place. After healing for days and days on end, we see Jesus again retreat, sending his disciples off by themselves while he stayed alone in the quiet place. One author says that the amount of time that Jesus spent in silence and in quiet places is directly proportional to the busyness of his life. That the busier life got for Jesus, the more he withdrew into the quiet places. See, if Jesus, the Son of God, needed regular times away in silence to hear God's voice, how crazy would we be to believe that we do not? Am I right? So here's my challenge to you. Today, before you go to bed, whether it's on your phone, on a day planner, or just a scratched piece of paper, I want you to schedule 10 minutes every day for the next 7 days for silence. Once in the morning and once in the evening. And during that time, just simply sit in the quiet. See, it's great to spend a few minutes reading just before this, but make sure that after you're done reading, you get that full 10 minutes in the quiet. Hey, here's a great place to start. Read through the book of Galatians. It's 6 chapters long, so you can miss a day and not feel terrible. Read a chapter of Galatians and then spend 10 minutes sitting and listening for God's voice. Before you start your time, make sure to ask God to help you clear your mind and to hear him. If it helps, imagine your most daunting or draining part of your life in the palm of your hand, and imagine God coming near to lift it away. And then, with that in mind, just be quiet before God for 10 minutes and see what he does. Allow God to lead your thoughts and expect him to speak in one way or another. If everything unravels and it falls apart, you got 10 minutes of peace and quiet. I mean, who wouldn't kill for that? But if things go right, what could be different? What would it be like if God actually showed up during this week ahead and spoke to you? See, we have a God who has no fear, no worries, and he again knows precisely what to do. What could happen if you started and ended your day listening to him? Let's pray. God, I pray for everyone that's listening to this message today, and I pray for the week ahead. God, would you do things that just blow us away? Would you speak in ways that we didn't even know you could? Would you bring peace into our lives and help give direction to our next steps? Lord, as we spend this time alone in silence with you, would you show up and speak your love right back into our lives? Amen.